Bueno, hablaremos después.
Ya está ahí, Carl.
Hello.
Hi, Carl. How are you?
Great. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thank you for joining us today.
It's totally my pleasure. Thank you.
I bet you're running as a director nowadays.
Yeah,
so thank you for your time.
No, it is exhausting, but it's nice to be exhausting physically again, like moving around, going into studio, seeing people. So
yeah, how are things there?
good. We have almost returned to normal. We have too many students now because a lot of students took a leave of absence and now are all back. And so the BEB, you would almost not recognize it. It's so, we had to buy new furniture because it's so dense. So it's a real problem actually. But it's a good problem. Better than the opposite kind of problem.
I know. Oh, I missed the BB. So I wanted to introduce you to Ana
Yes,
Maria
please.
and Christian. This is Carl. So Carl and I were, you were looking in my thesis and various other courses. So
Yeah.
I'm glad to have you here.
One thing I remember very clearly is your winter session course that you taught.
Oh yes, and you were in my review, remember?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Sara. Welcome.
Hi, how are you? Nice to see you.
Hi,
Nice to have
Sara.
you here.
Hi.
So I wanted to introduce you to Marisabel and Christian. The three of us organized the series of conferences. So welcome. It's really an honor to have you both here and to finally meet you.
Yeah. It's great to be here.
Sara, what a background. I love it.
I know this is what I've been doing during the pandemic. Pretending I pretend that I live somewhere really nice by growing tropical plants in the office.
Beautiful. How hard is it to grow tropical plants up in the northern hemisphere?
Outside, it's probably impossible, but inside, it's well, I think pretty easy plants. Like I buy the ones that are easy to take care of.
Do you have to spray them a lot though? Like, no?
No, my strategy is I forget about them. I water them kind of infrequently, and if they make it, then they make it.
Yeah.
So
I live here in the tropics, so
yeah,
it's easy for
Yes.
us.
so lucky. Yeah, you're so lucky.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Nothing makes me happier than to see books, light, and plants. Like those three things together make everything I need. And then assuming there's a way to make coffee. Those are like, I guess, the four things that as long as they can exist. Yeah.
So today we wanted to let you know, maybe Christian will let you know how is the schedule. Christian, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think we're going to begin with Sara.
Okay.
First, I think that Ana Maria is going to introduce you. Then we're going to continue with your presentation. Then afterwards, Marisabel is going to introduce Carl. Then we continue with Carl. And at the end, we will have some time for questions and comments from the audience. So that is more or less how we're planning to go ahead.
Sounds good.
So I don't know if you have any technical like things we wanted to check before we start. I thought maybe Carl wanted to do something because of your email.
Maybe I'll just, yeah, do a quick test to make sure the sound, there's just one video that plays sound. So if I can just quickly make sure that that's working. At this point, I'm so used to Zoom, it almost always works. It does look like you need to enable screen sharing before I do that.
Yeah. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, now you can share.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I always forget to check that. Okay. How's that? Making weird noises at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Very much so.
Okay, cool. That's it.
Great.
Okay, great. Sarah, do you have something with sound or something you want to try?
I have nothing with sound, but I could just try to just make sure that it works.
Okay, great.
Let me see. Let's see if it will work. I'll share screen. Share. Does it work? You see something that says Urban Lab?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, great. So I'm ready, I think.
Okay. People start into-
We're having people join quickly, so I think maybe we leave a few more minutes and then we can start on time to make
Yes.
out of
Yeah. Our students tend to take their time, so so it is better that way. And in the past session, we had around almost 85, 90 students. So that is more or less the amount of people that we are awaiting.
Anyway, and next time you have to come to Quito, although it's a very far plane ride, but hopefully you can come down. It would be great.
I would like to, yeah.
That would be amazing.
Have you ever been to South America?
I've been to Argentina.
Okay.
So you flew over us.
Yes.
The
Complete-
airport in Quito is special, right? Like it's on the high, I remember from your thesis or something, right? Like it's yeah, like
Well,
yeah.
we relocated that airport that was like embedded in the city, like outside, but it's gonna, the airport that we have now is beginning to build up quite quickly again.
Like
So
more
that-
development around the airport.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the thesis around like the side of my thesis
Yeah.
now has like around it 32 stories high.
Wow.
No, the density is gonna go up quickly here in Quito. It's changed a lot since the airport moved out of the city.
So, Carl, you are in Providence and Sarah is
Providence,
in
yes.
Chicago?
Had you met each other or not?
No.
I don't think so. Maybe we've been at the same conference or something at some point. I know of your work for sure, Sarah, but I'm pretty sure we've never met in person.
Yeah, I've been through Providence a couple times recently, but I haven't stopped to see recently, but it's a really, I mean, I think your programs are really great. Really good work.
It's a fun little city, close to things, but away from things a bit. Yeah.
Actually, Sarah, two of your students at Columbia are now teaching here in our school. I don't know if you remember Karina and Cristina.
Yes, they're great.
Yeah. And I was also a student there, so I remember your studio and everything, and that's why I said, okay.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because your studio was so amazing in terms of drawing, and so that's why we were really interested in your approach.
Awesome. Yeah, they are great. They're great students. I loved having them.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was awesome.
I'm sure they're hearing you now. They just
here?
can't
Oh,
speak.
nice.
Yeah, they're here.
Oh,
That's
nice.
why I
Probably-
told you, because I saw their name, so I said, okay, yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah, they're oh.
Oh,
very
Karina.
Uh, Christian, should we start perhaps?
Let's wait 2 more minutes, 11:05,
Yeah,
just to
great.
just because of the notion of order, rather for rather than because of waiting.
Perfect.
Maybe I can share this screen so people can share the.
Great, I think that we can begin 11:05.
Anna, you're on mute.
Thank you, Marisa. Yeah, sometimes it mutes, I don't know by itself, so I don't realize. Okay. So let's start. Welcome everybody to the third session of the lecture series, Drawing the Future, Visions of Architectures to Come. Today we have two guests, Sara Dunn from University of Illinois at Chicago and Carlos Lostrito from Rhode Island School of Design. We are going to start with Sara's presentation, followed up by Carl's presentation. Please feel free to send all your questions in the questions and comments window. We will address all of your questions after both lectures are over. So as I said before, we're going to start with Sara. Sara Dunn is a co-principal of Urban Lab, an architecture and urban design firm. She and her partner, Martin Pilsen, established Urban Lab to respond to the complexity, growth, and unintended consequences of the modern city by developing a catalog of architectural, infrastructural, and urbanistic design strategies. In particular, examining natural and artificial systems underpinning the built environment. Sara's Labs project spans scales from large urban proposals to small residential projects and exhibitions. Built work to date includes mixed-use commercial buildings, houses, restaurants, art galleries, landscape, large-scale resilient infrastructural projects, and cities. Sara's work has been recognized nationally and internationally. Awards include first prize in the History Channel City of the Future competition, the American Institute of Architects, College of Fellows Lothrop Prize, and several design awards from the AIA Chicago. In 2010, the Architectural League of New York selected Urban Lab for their Emerging Voices program. Urban Lab has exhibited at the Venice Biennale in 2010 and 2012, and in the Chicago Architectural Biennale in 2015 and 2017. Urban Lab's work is in the collection of art of the Art Institute of Chicago in the MoMA PS1. In 2017, Sara and Martin published Following Water, Architecture, Urbanism, a book documenting Urban Lab's speculative projects that realign architecture and infrastructure with natural resources. Sara is a professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has also taught at Columbia University and Washington University in St. Louis. Welcome, Sara. It's an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you to Maria Isabel and Christian as well. And also special shout out to Karina and Christina, Karina Kazar and Christina Vargas, who are former students of mine at Columbia and are now back with you in Quito. They're going to be very familiar with what I'm about to present, so they might be a little bored. Let me share my screen. Let me try. Okay, hold on one second. There we go. Okay, sorry. Oh, it's not working. Let's see. Okay, so I had many possibilities of different things to talk with you about today in terms of drawing, but reading over the brief of the symposium again, I realized, of course, there's really only one thing for me to talk about, and that's Urban Lab's work at the urban scale. As Anna mentioned, we recently completed a book about our projective, utopian, but I would say also pragmatic, even though someone might argue, ideas about urban scale architecture. We start with this idea that we can hybridize architecture, infrastructure, and landscape. And with these hybrids, we can wrap them up in cultural desires in order to produce design innovation, with a goal of new lifestyles and new forms of collective association, which really means new ways to live and new types of public space. And we are always looking back to the radical architecture groups of the 60s and 70s, like Superstudio, Archigram, Archizoom, because we know that they were also at their time trying to grapple with the issues of their day. They were interested in the way people live, so what we call lifestyle. They were interested in dealing with crisis. This is a Superstudio collage dealing with the flooding of Florence. I mean, it didn't flood this much, but they were kind of taking crisis and thinking deeply about it, and making projections about how the world could be, how architecture, landscape, and infrastructure could be modified in order to produce new ways to live. They were doing it through drawings, collage, a lot of collage, which are the ones that we really look at, but also other forms of drawing. And so we also use the same ideas, because we actually see that the crises that they were talking about are still very similar to the ones we were talking about today. And so the means of dealing with those crises for architects could be the same. We set up a set of rules that we, over the course of doing the projects, kind of teased out. And maybe one project as a kind of really simple way to understand how drawing really directly relates to our process, or is our process. Basically, we can't think it unless we draw it. We can't draw it unless we think it. This is a projective project for Chicago, looking at a very large stadium in the middle of the city. Many American cities have this condition where there's a large public amenity but what it's surrounded by is not dense neighborhood, but actually parking lot. So you can see like the pink is all parking lot. And this has been growing over many years. Our proposal is that the parking lot actually reduces the quality of life around the stadium. It makes the neighborhood less strong, less well off. And so we propose to actually make a kind of like continuous monument around the stadium in order to prevent that parking from producing more empty lots, because that's what seems to happen. Like parking, which is a void space in the city, often produces more void space next to it. So you can see here, like the parking exists and there are all these void spaces around it, which is not how it used to be. And so we propose, what if there's kind of a super studio continuous monument style thing around the stadium in order to collect the energy of the parking within it and allow a kind of new urbanism to develop around it. We propose a kind of elemental urbanism based on the Chicago typology to inhabit that wall, which becomes less of a wall and more of a threshold and a gateway. And this is how it kind of like looks in elevation if you unfold it. In order to allow the neighborhood to fill in around the stadium, and also in order to rethink how the space within the threshold now could work. This particular stadium is used only in the winter, and so we thought of all sorts of program for the landscape around. The parking has to remain parking, but it could also be so many other things. So in this way, it's kind of a hybridized moment of infrastructure, landscape, and architecture in order to produce a new way to be in the city. So specifically for bowling, why do we call it bowling? It's kind of a silly word. If you're familiar with American style bowling, it's a sport that people do when they're drinking a lot. So you don't really, nobody's really, well, there are some people who are very good at bowling. We're talking about bowling in a different way. So bowling as a process, a form, and an organization. So the process of making a bowl, the form of the bowl, and the organization that the bowl produces. And so this idea of bowls and bowling is to hold and harness resources. So this kind of bowl, not the sporting kind of bowl. And the bowl, our idea of bowling is that we form figures. So as architects, we're really interested in the graphic and of course, drawing the graphic. So for example, this is a bowl. The organization of a bowl of bowling organizes programs and services in circumscribed areas. So the bowl produces an edge. Like this is for us a bowl. And so we produced this book that has these projects, which, as I mentioned, are all speculative, all fairly utopian, but all trying to be somewhat pragmatic. We use a reference of actually from history when let's see, the idea of the Aral Sea, which, as some of you may know, is a sea that has been shrunk through political policy. It used to look like this, and now on the left, and now it looks like this on the right. So it's a bowl that's been mismanaged by favoring certain social policies over others. It used to be quite a large sea in the world, and so just to know that a lot of our crises can be managed better, and they can also be managed worse. So this is an example of worsening management. And then the opposite is an island in at the Ascension Island, which is in one that was visited in 1835, and was kind of was a kind of a desertish island, but was populated by the explorers who explored it with a series of different types of plants. And as over the years, it turned from a desert island into a kind of very lush island that has its own microclimate today. I should mention that this was an island that was visited by Darwin, and then people who came after, as well as he, kind of populated it with this new set of plants, which produced a new landscape. So some of our projects are, most of our projects are not proposing something so radical, although we'll show one at the end which does propose something super radical like that. So this, I'll go really, how much time? I don't want to spend too much time so we have enough time to have conversation, but the set of projects that we propose are mostly dealing with United States problems, but there are this type of problem many places. So not that it's a stand-in for other places, but just that, you know, we all could be thinking differently and bigger and more holistically. So, for example, this project is located, and the book is set up, the United States kind of has, some areas have too much water and some areas have not enough water. And we often hear about the areas in the west of the United States which have not enough water. But this project has to do with actually having too much water. And it's called Free Water District. And the idea starts from the fact that in the Great Lakes we have 20% of the Earth's fresh water, surface water. And that's quite a lot, and we should be better stewards of it. At the same time, so we're taking water out in Chicago and we're not putting water back in. At the same time, the Great Lakes region and the water around, the land around the Great Lakes has been losing many, many jobs to the south and the southwest, where they actually in the southwest have not enough water, but the climate's really good. So, for example, nobody really wants to live through Chicago winter, so they all move to Arizona. Totally understandable, but it's a problem. So this is a kind of example of a typical American Rust Belt city where there's a dense neighborhood to one side, and then there's all this kind of post-industrial landscape, which many, many architects are thinking about. What is the post-industrial landscape as economies go through cycles and get to the point where they no longer manufacture as much as they used to. They're left with these landscapes where extraction has taken a huge toll. Yet around these sites, there are neighborhoods full of people who are looking for jobs and don't have them. So this idea comes from, and again, we're doing this through drawing. So we have aerials, we have diagrams, we have collaging. So the idea is by making these drawings, we figure out what our idea is, which is a set of rules that in this particular proposal, one could set up what we call a free water district, in which you could take out water from the Great Lakes and use as much of it as you want, which is a pretty radical idea, as long as you employ the people around the district, and any water that you are finished with, you don't need, you clean it passively and put it back in the lake where you got it. And so we test this idea with this idea of a kind of dense neighborhood, insert a kind of new public space, which in this case is a research and development university, probably a lot like your university, which holds a kind of the center, and around it, these factories that use water start to grow up, and it's organized. This is a model that we showed at the Venice Biennale of the center, which would be this research university. And here you see the landscape and the building kind of coming together, and that's because this is functioning as a kind of social collector, but also a water collector, and dealing with using water, cleaning water, holding water when there's a lot of rain. And so here we see a section of the lake, the factory, the streets which are collecting water, the university, and the landscape around it, which makes a kind of public space or set of public spaces for the neighborhood to use. And this is maybe what it might look like at the end, where there's this zone where instead of like it's almost like a tax-free zone. Instead of tax-free, it's free water. And that, what could that do? So, you know, maybe never going to happen, but interesting to play out. Which brings us to this other project, was maybe most exactly like a kind of a drawing exercise where we draw lines through the city in order to deal with public space and an ecological problem at the same time. And so, for example, the city of Chicago is the only city in the Great Lakes that takes water out and doesn't put it back. And the water that we take out from the Great Lakes, we actually break we break through to another watershed. So we are currently in the Great Lakes watershed. We take our water out and put it in the Mississippi Great watershed, which actually flows down to the Gulf of Mexico and makes a lot of ecological damage where it meets the Gulf of Mexico because of, in a large part, what Chicago adds to the water. So this is a way to draw in order to understand the land formation and what Chicagoans did 100 years ago when they cut through. And this is not an unusual thing to do in 100 years ago, to manipulate, and still happens today, to manipulate watersheds. The reason Chicago is where it is because it is on the border between two watersheds. It's very easy to get from one to the other. And the wealth of the city is because of this kind of connection between the two watersheds and shipping. So if you're studying ecological issues, you understand that open loops, that nature doesn't really produce open loops. Usually nature makes closed loops where something is used and then something else uses the waste of that and then waste, and it kind of goes in a big circle. So currently Chicago is breaking a loop, and so we're proposing that Chicago would repair that loop. And also, if you may know, that Chicago, as being part of the United States, is organized on this giant grid that was instituted in 1789 by Thomas Jefferson and his colleagues in the Senate, and they made this organization of the United States, they gridded it out as a way to understand it and conquer it and extract from it. And so in Chicago, we live with this grid, which kind of conveniently lines up very nicely with the organization of the city. And so by drawing this line, like documenting this line here, which is this magenta line, the dashed line, it's actually the border between one watershed, the Great Lakes, and the other, the Mississippi. Any water that would fall on the Great Lakes side would normally flow to the lake, except that we collect it and send it the other direction. So this project is us literally drawing lines along the streets in the city to collect water and put it back into the lake. And what do those lines look like? So then we draw the lines using the grid of east-west streets, and then we develop what do those lines of streets then kind of, how do they develop further, and what do they look like, and how do they work? And so again, our primary interest in producing new ways to live and new public space. So we look at the streets that collect water as being multifunctional. So they don't only function as car-centric anymore, but they go on what's called a road diet, and there's maybe fewer lanes of traffic, but there's more places to hang out or socialize. Not sure why I can't advance. Okay. So this is a typical street on the left, and a new Eco Boulevard on the right, potentially. This is one where it's extremely manipulated. There's still functions as a street, but mostly functions as new public space, and then also connects to existing parks as it goes east to west. I mean west to east. And then further following along from that, if we try to replumb the city and take water and not have it go to the Mississippi, we need to think about wastewater as well. And so we started to think about systems of, and draw these in order to understand them, systems by which you could capture dirty water, clean it, and distribute it back to the neighborhood and back to the lake. At the same time, producing new possible amenities for the neighborhoods that these pieces would go into, including recycling centers, bike stations, bus stops, and spas for the neighborhood. Using technology that currently exists. We used to have this phrase where we'd say no flying cars, although now that flying cars look like they actually closer than ever, we can't really say no more flying car. We don't, so we always try to use the technologies that currently exist, maybe not at the scale that we propose, but we're not proposing anything that is uninvented. It all exists in the world right now. So this idea of a kind of a living machine at a large scale, about a small scale but distributed throughout. So it's also a way to make identity for the different blocks and different neighborhoods. So every single one could be slightly different. I live by the lumpy cylinder one, and you live by the smooth cone one. And that's how we start to sort of find our way through the city, which actually in Chicago is kind of like if you drop me in somewhere in a neighborhood I don't know, because it's a grid, it's actually kind of hard to know where you are until you get to a diagonal street. It's all kind of the same everywhere. So these would function as kind of identity, as well as amenity, as well as cleaning water. And then produce things that don't currently exist. Like what if there was a little neighborhood pool in the sidewalk down the street from where you live? It could be quite interesting and different and beautiful. And so here we see a kind of image, again, organizing our thoughts through drawing, in this case, an axonometric. So far you've seen diagrams, collages, axonometrics, isometrics, sections, plans. Yeah, and I'm about to kind of try to make a really lame connection to model making too, because maybe that's not really drawing, but maybe it is. So I talked about how we have two issues in the United States with too much water or not enough water. This is a moment when we're having too much water in Chicago, and we, for some reason, had this Marilyn Monroe sculpture in our city for a while, and you see people taking cover under her dress when it was a big downpour, and we're having more and more downpours more often. And when that happens in Chicago, the excess water, the excess sewer water gets dumped into Lake Michigan, which is terrible because that's where we get our fresh water. And it is the reason why Chicago broke through the two watersheds 100 years ago in order to take our dirty water and send it to St. Louis instead of the lake, which is where we get our fresh water. And St. Louis is really annoyed, and they've actually sued us ever since then, but they can't win for some reason. So what we have done our engineers have thought of maybe it could be interesting to dig giant holes in order to hold water while we have these giant storms. And this is very interesting. It's a very large scale. It's kind of cool to look at, but it's not public. It doesn't do anything for everyone's life in terms of benefiting it, the life of the citizens. It costs a lot of money. And our thought is, if you're going to spend a lot of money, how about making it beneficial more directly to all the citizens beyond the infrastructural problem, which is something that we invented ourselves, the problem. The other thing is it costs a lot of money to take the extra water that flows in the city, overflows, and hold it in these reservoirs, except, you know, when most of the population lives kind of closer. So our idea is to think about unreversing the Chicago River, allowing it to flow back into the lake. But in order to do that, we need to clean the water before it gets to the lake. Can we then ask a question like, what if we clean the water and at the same time produce a new public space for the city? And can we do that in the style of the city's forefathers who 100 years ago made these giant master plans where they were thinking really big, they were reorganizing, that you may have heard, I don't know, of the Burnham Plan. It was kind of famous plan for Chicago, which reorganized the city to take more advantage of the lake, and the city as a whole benefited from a lot of its ideas. And so in the manner of the Burnham Plan, can we think big again, and can we solve problems while also producing new amenity at the same moment? So here we're drawing. We're comparing the project size to Venice and to the current set of reservoirs which hold our water. And again, drawing by understanding systems and looking toward landscape architecture and how landscape architects think about landscape in terms of layers and infrastructure. So how the water works, how the public space works. So it's essentially a park that like 50% of the park is devoted to cleaning water, and 50% is devoted on a normal day, devoted to public program. And it may change depending on how dry or wet it is. A series of diagrams to talk about how water flows through program. And then a model that we made for one of the Chicago biennials in order to take drawings and three-dimensionalize them. This model actually is 50% drawing as well. So this part at the wall is a drawing of a kind of fold up of the new filter island which comes out of the river. So these are some ideas that we've been working on. This one is a collage of a rainy day when the park is almost 100% devoted to cleaning water, not very devoted to public space at this moment, but then the sun comes out and the water is processed and it goes back to mostly program space for the citizens of the city. And then the last part of the project of the book is about a pretty radical idea, which is to take water and fill up Death Valley in order to change the microclimate of Death Valley and also deal with some amount of sea level rise. It certainly wouldn't do as much as would be necessary. It's quite insane of an idea. However, the Death Valley used to be full of water many, 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 many years ago. So the idea is like, what if, and it's a thought experiment, what if it were again? And what would that do again, a bowl, comparing it to different bowls in the world. What if we were to take salt water from the ocean, desalinate it as we pull it through the desert of the Southwest, and through aqueducts that might look like this. And then, I don't know, you probably know the really famous Super Studio collage. Here we're totally ripping it off. Here's our version of Super Studio Continuous Monument. There we go, that's the original. This one's better, I know, but anyway. So underneath the aqueduct, flora and fauna continues through the landscape uninterrupted or minorly inconvenienced, and on top, new ways to live. You recognize the naked hippies from Super Studios, one of their continuous monument collages. This is a model that we did for another Chicago biennial, in which we're looking at what are the lifestyles that might emerge, from living in the desert with a new set of microclimates that would be produced because of this insertion. New ways to live. So we looked at town organizations, how we might organize public space differently if we, for example, thought of three-dimensional zoning. So the orange is public and the white is private, either public, commercial or residential, how that might produce new town formations. So the American town is usually organized along one main street. It's the primary kind of social space is along a main street. So this is a kind of new main street, and how that might organize, and looking at it through drawings, plans, three-dimensional drawings, and collaging and perspectives. Also looking at more dense forms that might be urban scale, and how that might produce new ways to live and new typologies. So looking at different ways to live vertically, and looking at drawings there as well. And then also suburban organizations, which might be layered into an idea about farming and aquaculture, and producing new mat buildings that could take advantage of this new amount of water that would exist, and allow the inhabitants of this area to be food secure, but at the same time producing new typologies to live within and work within. And drawing, again, collaging, and referencing back to Super Studio, Archizoom, Archigram, and looking at how they were dealing with crisis and how they were thinking about making a case to the wider public through drawing. And that is it.
Thank you, Sara, for your presentation. I think it was great and extremely interesting. Now we can proceed with Carl. Marisa, I don't know if you can present. Carl?
Thank you, Sarah. That was lovely. It really showed us many ways of dealing with drawing and your ideas and this part of imagination and reality. So it was great. Thank you. So we'll go on and present Carl. So Carl Lostrito, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Carl is the graduate program director and associate professor at RISD Architecture. It's the Rhode Island School of Design, and his research, practice, and scholarship focus on design, computation, and representation, especially with respect to drawing. In 2019, Lostrito published Computational Drawing from foundational exercises to theories of representation. This book frames computation and drawing as barely compatible technologies whose combination warrants reflection and speculation. In his work, drawing productively disrupts the ability to conflate digital media with computational ideas, while computation disrupts the mythical status of drawing as territory for personal expression. A forthcoming book, Impossible and Hyper-Real Elements of Architecture, dissects rendering through an experimental approach aimed at disrupting conceptions of material, time, and space. Lostrito lectures and exhibits widely, including a recent show, Work on Paper, and workshop Depth Defying Drawing at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Lostrito joined the RISD faculty in 2012 and previously taught at the Boston Architectural College, MIT, Catholic University of America, and University of Maryland. Please welcome Carl Lostrito. Thank you, Carl.
So great to be here. Hi, everybody. I love that this has set up a dialogue between Sara and I, mostly because our work is very different, but also very related. And so I think there are some, and related by way of essentially considering drawing. So I think this is really the best type of event, because what I will present is not polemical. I don't have a totalizing position about the discipline of architecture. It's actually quite niche, but then depends on thinkers like Sara and your work in the urban lab to kind of make projects that advance the discipline. So with that, I will dive right in. I want to talk about vintage machines and classic algorithms in the pursuit of new representational paradigms. So that's very loaded. And, you know, I think immediately I see parallels with Sara's work and the look back at historical ways of drawing and what that can mean to advance speculative futures. I'm going to just annotate real quick, where like oftentimes we see future in like a timeline where like technology is advancing things in a clear axis. And what I'm proposing here kind of implicitly is a role for technology to kind of look like this, where you go back in time, grab something and then make a radical advancement, and then loop back in time, grab something and make a radical advancement. And so it looks a lot more like a bunch of loops, and then you end up somewhere that you didn't know you were going in the first place. So for me, this representational paradigm that I looked to in the past, let me clear this so it's not everywhere, involves these machines. These are pen plotters. There was an era, very short era, where if you were doing work on the computer and you wanted to see it, and it wanted to exist visually, you had to use a pen plotter because there weren't pixel screens. The computers were larger than a closet. I'm talking about the 40s, 50s, 60s into the 70s, where computing was almost exclusively text-based. And then there was another era after the personal computer was adopted, in which computers started to populate universities, design practices. Computer-aided design was a term, but even still, memory was in short supply. And so the idea of file print that we know today wasn't really viable yet, in part because the idea of rasterizing a plan or section drawing that was drafted was impossible. Think there's probably like 212 megabytes of RAM in your printer, for example, right? Like that amount of memory didn't really exist in the Western Hemisphere, conveniently, not too many decades ago. So these pen plotters are a lot like laser cutters. You have to move it's sending instructions to move a pen around on paper. So the resulting drawing is fabricated as opposed to printed. And those pens, because they're nothing fancier than just ink moving around on paper, the ink bleeds into the paper. And you can produce things that are a lot more like, have qualities of painting than drawing. And what you see on the screen is different than what exists on paper, right? So the digital drawing doesn't really exist and then is copied to paper. It's more that there's a digital space that leads to a material drawing. And that material drawing has consequences, right? Like all of a sudden the substrate comes into play, the ink bleeding into each other, the manipulation of the surface to the extent that it starts to behave like a ground that's been broken open. The machines are often also very hackable, right? They're really just two motors that move paper or a pen in two axes. So they're a lot more fun than printers of today. I don't know if you've ever tried to fix an inkjet printer that you bought today, but you can't. That's by design, right? Like there's chips inside that prevent you from doing messy things with it. So for a long time, I did almost nothing other than make drawings with the pen plotter. And so that meant also using algorithms from an era that is a bit passed by. So nothing about this is really parametric. Nothing about this is three-dimensional for the most part. These are like classic algorithms that kind of the pioneers of computer science and computer graphics were thinking about. This is the drawing that's on the cover of the book that I published. And I like to talk about it, and it's the one that had to be on the cover because there's so many good stories that are easy to tell through this drawing. And that's a lot of what I do also, is starting with technology, but then developing stories and narratives and meaning from that. So this a classic algorithmic approach to making drawings or graphics is to have two loops. So a loop is just a reoccurring set of code. And then you could have a loop inside of another loop that, makes reoccurring a set of reoccurring functions. A loop inside of a loop is a classic way to make a grid, for example, right? So looping to make a column, and then looping many columns to make a two-dimensional grid. This algorithm is an algorithm that makes a little ring, and then a loop outside of it that makes many, many rings. And so the key to this, though, is that there's a mistake. There was a little line of code that said switch pens. And that little line of code was supposed to go outside of the inner loop, but inside the outer loop. And instead, that little line of code mistakenly, because I'm a human and I make mistakes, went in the inner loop. And so therefore, at every little line segment, the pen plotter grabbed a different pen and made a tiny little segment. It meant the drawing was, instead of taking like 2 hours to produce, took over 20 hours to produce, because it's constantly switching pens, wearing the pens down. And if you look closely, there are all these artifacts of that switching, because it's constantly lifting up and putting new pens down. So you're seeing these little dots at the start of the line. And then do you see that red line, that kind of gash? That's another mistake. Because this was being worked over so much, the paper started to buckle a little bit. And at the very end, as it's putting the pen back in its spot, it had gotten bulgy so much that the paper scraped against the pen and made that error. So I go looking for things like this, like these unrepeatable qualities of a drawing that really are dependent on the digital and computation, but that are divorced from it in some key way. Other algorithms that I look at are cartographic algorithms. So this is an algorithm, like an 18th century algorithm for drawing a surface that was deployed to draw the surface of the Earth usually. And it basically involves considering the normal vector of a surface, drawing a little hatch line that would be a common length in 3 dimensions, and then orthographically projecting that line so that it results in a segment in the map that is a different length and different orientation depending on the relief of the surface. So this is deploying that in a totally non-cartographic context. Here's another super simple algorithm. This is inspired by the Paul Klee, I call it an algorithm, but it's not really an algorithm. A line is like a point that has gone for a walk. And so if you take that premise of like a line is conscious of its direction and its position, then it's possible to program that line to do exactly that, go for a walk. And then it can retrace its steps and can, for example, look at a common point and treat that point as a like a vanishing point in a drawing. Here's another line going for a walk, but the line that goes for a walk leaves a trail, and that trail is a dashed line. And this is something I can easily get obsessed over dashed lines like that. That's the world, the mental state that I often inhabit, where dashed lines in Illustrator are super boring, right? They're just a line style. But what if the dash was like material and the little space between it was like an opening in the wall? And so this line going for a walk and leaving a trail is like driving a car now. And the line is steering a car so that it finds openings in its own trail. And then when pen plotted, other dimensions of scale, this starts to look like a planet or a sphere. The third dimension kind of creeps in. And this is all part of that cycling back in history. I often think about the fact that we have theoretical ideas in the discipline now that are very different than the theoretical ideas we had in the 60s when the pen plotters first existed, or nascent postmodernism in the 80s when the first digital turn was happening, and how those ideas are different from today, and the kind of strange, uncanny, or weird potential that can come by returning to some of those methods and thinking about them with today's concerns, today's ideas. So you might be wondering, where's the architecture here? And I'm not there yet, but I do want to make a proposal that a drawing can be an entire world. So in this drawing, this sort of drawing project, I'm using like fake physics and making a simulation that's grossly out of scale to make a drawing that is the entire lifespan of a whole world that has clouds and water and weather and rain, various events captured entirely in the drawing. And it's completely, the word simulation here is completely, it's very much misused. There are springs that represent molecules, that gravity is a gradient. There are 3 dimensions, but not every dimension has equal status. There's collision and conservation of, or there's non-conservation of mass or energy. But the resulting drawings are also only part of the story. This is a long body of code that is like the window into the world. It's also a 100,000 line work of narrative writing generated by the code, right? The log file describes at every frame what's happening. It's super long and super boring. And it's the kind of thing that in computation, a log file would be used for like debugging, figuring out where the problems were. And in this case, when I exhibited this, I think you heard from Kina Leski, my colleague at RISD, we exhibited her storm drawings and my storm drawings together. And they're of course super different, and they're different down to like the core of where the content is, like where in this case, the text and the drawing are kind of on equal footing. Here is a animation of, and it'll speed up. And I will make it speed up even more. This is a time lapse of a storm drawing. So it's also an open question whether drawing in this case is most appropriately considered as a verb or a noun, right? So I think it's arguable here in the world of pen plotting that the final artifact drawing is not as important or not as meaningful as the act of drawing. So another way to kind of creep towards a built work is to think about elements of architecture. So I have a series of works that start to introduce architectural elements like the hatch in ways that are kind of overly detailed compared to what the capacity of the drawing or the resolution of the drawing seems to sustain. So in this case, I'm drawing these hatches, and I love the word hatch. So hatch can mean like crosshatch, like a little line that is not quite a full line, like a mini line or a imperfect line or a line that hasn't totally grown up yet to stand on its own, always requiring a system of other hatches. A hatch can also be a kind of door that's hidden, or a door that's not quite fully formed or fully grown up. Or in like naval architecture, a hatch often is a door that is, when closed, completely flush with the surface. So in this, the goal here is to think about like to poke at some conventions of architecture or some assumptions of material elements and their relationship to drawing. Here's another hatched hatch. Another way to poke at material architecture is to expect that the drawing itself is a material science kind of study. So the drawing on paper that rips the paper, to me, is an opportunity to think about that whole system as a kind of material experiment, like a not just a model that comes from reading a drawing, but all of a sudden the drawing becomes so thick and so consequential in terms of its material that it actually becomes the work of architecture as opposed to being transformed into the work of architecture. So if this is why I like writing scripts and doing coding, it becomes very easy to kind of step laterally to different machines. So I don't know if you've encountered these machines before. I only knew them because if you go to a big shopping mall, it was like a place where you could get your logo etched on like a hat or a t-shirt. Like these are digital stitching machines. But to me, that's really exciting because a digital stitching machine is a drawing apparatus. And so because it's a drawing apparatus, it becomes possible to put content on substrate fabric, but then not just with the agenda of being able to read shapes and forms, but with an agenda of affecting the material performance of that fabric. So the drawing on the left is generating a circular bulge, but that circular shape is entirely the result of a lot of complicated material things happening, right? Like in the same way that very first green drawing I showed was the result of blue and yellow pens mixing together. This shape is the result of rectilinear lines affecting the surface and then having that surface kind of manifest in 3 dimensions. And like a work of architecture, the underside or the inside or the behind the scenes or the scaffolding is more exciting than the cleaned up front of the sketched drawing. I also try to learn a lot from other artistic cultures. So this is an engraving that is part of the RISD Museum's collection. So it's not particularly special, but it's particular to you maybe, but it's particularly special to me because I can go and look at this in person regularly. The subject is fascinating, but the part that I like to look at, I'm not sure if you see my mouse, so I'm going to just annotate real quickly. I often look at like this spot here and that edge, the place where the value of the scene, the darkness of the background and the darkness of the shadowy part of the spoon are exactly the same level of gray, but the lines behave completely differently there. And those lines behave in a particular way because the artist is informed by what he is seeing. And so the spoon lines and the background lines are not just processed lines. They're not just like a digital photograph that senses value and then articulates lines based on that value. It's incredibly subjective. And the idea that a drawing can be incredibly subjective and also incredibly affiliated with reality is like both something that architects, I think, take for granted and we're super accustomed to, but is something that is essential to reflect on because it gets directly, there was that moment in Sarah's presentation where like there was that one essential line, right? Like the breach between the Mississippi River Delta and the Lake Michigan, for example, that planetary scale line was so relevant and so important. I think it's possible to talk about this type of line on the spoon and that planetary line, not as equivalent, but in the same kind of disciplinary context. Okay, so let me get rid of that line and move forward. So that approach to like every line counts is actually quite challenging to digital media, in which there's often a break between the content that exists in a digital model and a content that exists in a digital drawing. We tend to generate our flat content from a model. And so lines that exist in the digital drawing usually come after or based on lines that were generated in the physical model. And so drawings like that engraving, that 16th century engraving, are not easy to do or not automatic to do digitally. This also happens to be a spherical projection algorithm that was like a very contentious cartographic question in the 17th and 18th centuries, right? Like how are we going to draw the Earth and how are we going to map the Earth? So there's some really weird speculative ideas about how to draw a sphere. Buckminster Fuller got involved in the 20th century with the same kind of experimentation in spherical projections. So this is the drawing on the right is multiple spherical projections in which the hatches are also spherically projected. So they come with the form into the drawing. The drawing on the left was a drawing of an existing house. So we're not too far away here in Rhode Island from this Marcel Brewer house in Massachusetts. It's a private residence. You can't really go visit it, but it's decently well documented. It's a Breuer-Gropius collaboration. And this RISD student, Robert Sugar, and I spent some time drawing it. And in the process of drawing it, eventually modifying it to a significant degree. But then instead of proposing a completely new built work, we kind of followed where all the tangents took us. And one of the tangents was this extremely large stone wall that required its own algorithm to draw. And so we developed this algorithm that looked at cultures of stonemasons and their unwritten algorithms about how they would go from a pile of stones to a stone wall. It's a beautiful algorithm that is not easy to write down and is not easy to replicate computationally because it's incredibly subjective. There's a lot of intuition and there's not one solution. It's not like you have a pile of rocks and there's a right way to make a stone wall. But there's also a lot of knowledge that's required to make a stone wall work. And so that led to the drawing and then eventually that elevation. I want to show, to kind of wrap up a bit, And I have another set of drawings that I can show as like an optional, depending on where the question and answer period take us. But I want to end with a couple of drawings that are RISD students that just sort of show a potential arc from drawing to reassess materials and space to a speculative installation or artifice or artifact to a potential project. And this is actually a transformation of Gaudi's Sagrada Familia turned into a single family house. So absurd, yes. Would we want to ever build this? No. Does it potentially generate knowledge? And does it break open some assumptions about what a drawing versus a model might be? That's the kind of thing that I'm hoping for. This is another student, Frank Gonzalez Core, that is looking at another speculative drawing of a piece of architecture, re-rendering that, and in the process of representation, arriving at a totally new idea for a work of architecture. So this is my stopping point here. That is where I would like to kind of end and then consider questions, and then the bonus slides will only come out if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. We hope those bonus slides do come out. I give the word to Christian, who will be moderating the question and answer between both of you. So, and again, thank you. That was really interesting. I love the stitches. And yeah, I would like to see the drawings like in person.
Yeah, that's the best thing, because this lecture is basically championing the material quality of drawing, but then I'm showing it to you over Zoom. So that's actually quite, to me, the best is when I can visit a place, bring a drawing, help you make drawings with me, and then we're talking together about a shared thing we make. To me, that's the best way to have a cultural discourse about drawing. I also like Sarah's phrase, cultural desires. Like a lot of, I love that phrase because it's different than saying like cultural conditions or cultural problems or cultural crises. It basically suggests that cultures can have aspirations. And to me, that's especially when you take those aspirations and you reflect on real, legitimate, urgent conditions and change how we think about the planet. Super exciting.
We'll have you down for a workshop, hopefully.
Cool.
Let's cross our fingers.
There's a pen plotter. There's a pen plotter that can fit on a carry-on. So I could bring it. I've done it before.
We'll search for some here too.
Okay, yes, yeah.
That'd be a good idea too. Well, anyway, Christian, it's your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara, and thank you, Carl. Let's begin with the questions that we have in the chat and in the Q&A section. And Double AA Studio, I guess that's 4 AAs, asks, how difficult is to transfer the conceptual ideas that often are very expensive to real-life situations? Thus, these conceptual ideas should be developed under these real-life constraints. This is a question for Sara.
Okay, so how to translate these ideas into real life is essentially the question?
Or how do you take those real-life constraints into considerations at the moment of design and drawing?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that the way we approach it is to the real life constraints, which we are always trying to balance with the theoretical project, is to the theoretical project we hope can withstand and absorb the real life constraints. So, for example, in the very first example I showed, which was maybe the most buildable one, which would be the one around the stadium. Maybe initially we thought about that the parking was actually not good and we would want to remove it. But in fact, planners see it as a good thing. It solves a problem, and it generates income for certain groups, and so you can't just take it away. So even though it might be better for the neighborhood were there to be no giant parking lot, since it's a reality that we have to deal with, it's a constraint that pushes back against a kind of desire. It motivates us to then kind of layer on top of it new possibilities. So if it's a constraint, we like to think of problems to turn problems into potentials, to say, okay, it's a problem, but how can we make it actually something positive for the idea? So I think maybe it's an attitude to take the constraint and use it to make the project not purely utopian, but practically utopian in some way, like a practical utopianism. That's how we actually need the constraints. Otherwise, I don't think that the projects would have as much resonance for the people to whom we propose them to. So in Chicago, when we proposed turning the streets into water filtration zones, it sparked a lot of imagination in the general public because it was very much of the city, dealing with the existing infrastructure of the city, which is a long way to say, like, the constraint of the city is actually the strength of the project, I guess.
Since you mentioned this notion of utopia, perhaps we can continue with a question by Eduardo. And he asks to both of you, could both of your types of design be considered as utopian, or are they utopias? How far are we as a society who could afford this kind of ideas to be actually executed, both economically and philosophically?
Well, I could start by saying that we always are thinking about the ethical and the economic and the ecological reasons, constraints to do the projects. So we very seriously consider them real proposals, and the project that I just mentioned, the one that deals with the streets in Chicago, in a previous administration, political administration, we had conversations and went some way toward doing several test cases in the streets, so like a real implementation. Then the administration changed, and the next administration was not that interested in it. But there are like sort of demonstration projects in the city. They don't look like what we imagined because there's other constraints, but I think it's a long way to say that for us it's a kind of practical utopianism. So we take the project seriously and propose it seriously, even if it has a long chance of, like a very limited chance of being implemented, but that there is the possibility, maybe not now, but in the future. And maybe it's not ever implemented here, but it sparks something somewhere else. And in some cases, we've done some work in China where we take the ideas that we have in Chicago and we attempt to implement them in other places.
Yeah, that resonates with me quite a bit. This kind of like practical utopianism. I often I think a lot about the psychology of changing someone's mind. That's been in the news a lot here about like the relationship people have with facts and ideology. And changing someone's mind or changing an organization's mind or changing a society's mind, it turns out is extremely slow and extremely non-linear. And often the first step is showing that person or that organization something disarming or funny or non-threatening, right? So I often find a lot of utopian ideas come out later on, right? Like they don't initially purport to be big ideas, or even, and a lot of the work I do starts out so silly, like making a joke almost, and then that joke turns out to be, oh, actually the result is kind of beautiful and interesting. And then that just sort of warrants another look at something, and then that another look at something reframes a question, and then all of a sudden someone is open to, you know, completely different systems or paradigms or value systems. So I think to me, drawing provides an opportunity to always leave open the potential that something is utopian without having to buy into a utopian framework at the beginning, or to kind of have all the constraints of utopianism world building.
Here I would like to pose a question to Carl of my own, a little bit based on Sarah's idea of cultural desires. Bernard Cash, the French philosopher, I'm sure Carl is very familiar with him. You know, he argues, long story short, that you know, the computational tools, no matter how basic they are far from innocent. You know, they, you know, carry with them, as you mentioned, persons, organizations, economies, so on and so forth. So, and I think that this is a particularly important question when you teach this kind of techniques and ideas. So how do you take into consideration all those constraints, all those ideologies, you know, behind, you know, the capitalism behind computers,
Yeah.
into consideration when you sort of, you know, produce these kind of drawings? Because Bernard Cash more or less is saying, you know, we're not inventing anything because the basic parameters are given and they are quite fixed.
Yeah, I think I think Bernard Cash is totally correct. I mean, it's also something, it's very much in the news right now, the political implications of like Facebook's algorithms, for example, right? So there's no such thing as an apolitical or unconstrained or unbiased technology. What helps me a lot is to recognize that drawing is fundamentally a technology also. And there is no possibility of an unbiased or apolitical line. Every line is a border. Every line is charged. Every line is the result of an implement or an instrument. It always comes with capital. So to me, whatever medium you're working in, the human is charged with taking control of that medium and of that technology, or making a medium of that technology is another way of looking at it. So I guess another related principle is, before you make a work of architecture with that very loaded, very political apparatus or implement or technology, it warrants reflection, like it warrants consideration what you can make that will allow the reflection back. What kind of drawings can we make, or what kind of algorithms can we make, or what kind of computational paradigms can we make that automatically force us to not just have a result, but to have something that's involved in a cycle, so that we can't proceed until we reflect on it. And then another related thing is that we can break some of those cycles by being egalitarian or open with the code that we make and write, especially in design, where we're interested in generating knowledge as opposed to being proprietary about our applications. So one of the most painful realities of computation is that we make and sell software, and software is a proprietary product, open source stuff aside. But in design, we're often not interested in selling the tool. We're interested in expanding the scope of that tool. So it becomes possible for us to think about the encapsulation of that algorithm differently than computer scientists or computer engineers or software developers would feel pressure to do.
I think that's very interesting and also very provocative. Perhaps we can continue in the same line with a question by Julia. And I think that this is a question for both of you. How does the train of thought develop when using a drawing apparatus? Does the architectural idea need to exist first, or does the drawing help to achieve that idea itself?
I'm going to start for this one, if that's okay, Sarah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think this question is very wise and very difficult. And there's actually a circular loop embedded in the question, which is basically a drawing apparatus is already a work of architecture. So it is, if you are encountering an apparatus, you are already inside a work of architecture. So even if you tried to have no ideas, right? You just tried to just draw with no provocation, no feedback, no context, I would argue that would be impossible because the apparatus itself is already bringing some constraints. So I think it's a beautiful question. It's a question that can be constantly asked, but I don't know where to start in that question, right? It's sort of like a chicken and the egg kind of question. So and I think it's a question that can be asked constantly, and even far deep into a thesis project, for example. I think someone can ask that question, like, what am I doing here? Is the architecture generating the ideas, or are the ideas generating the architecture, or is it always a bit of both? Sorry, that's a bit of I found an escape hatch to that question, but that's where I would come at it.
Yeah, I agree with Carl's chicken and egg analogy because I think, you draw to think and you think when you draw. So I'm not sure if you can have an idea. I think even if you have the idea in your head, you still are seeing a drawing of it. You're seeing some kind of initial idea as some kind of three-dimensional thing, perhaps, or two-dimensional thing, and you draw it, and you haven't developed the idea, and so it kind of goes, and one hopes kind of forward vector, but of course, as Carl's saying, it's kind of always looping back and forth as you're thinking. So I would imagine it's a hard question to answer. The only time I think you're not thinking while you're drawing is when you're doodling. If your mind is somewhere else. But I think for architects especially, it's probably very hard to not it's very hard probably to separate thinking and drawing, because we're trained from very early that's how you think, is by drawing.
I think that thinking of that sort of loop of the use of that process of continuation. Here is a question by Martin, which perhaps sheds some light. And he says, Manfredo Tafuri referred to the avant-garde tradition of the mid-1960s as executing the rite of creative exorcism in isolation. Is it a possibility that topics of global warming, inequality, diversity, etc., and their utopian or practical utopianism solutions from the Architectural Academy front as a way to continue this creative exorcism? The loop as a kind of way of exorcising all these sort of issues. And if so, how architects can avoid this So they focus more in advancing architecture itself.
So
Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead, Carl.
Okay, so maybe we can unpack this a bit together. Because I think my inclination is to a little bit confront some of the premises of that question. I think, for example, the idea of the front for something, right? The idea that there is something speculative that's like holding off like concerns, like providing either an advanced front, as though like we're a discipline expanding and like we're at that threshold moving forward, or there's a kind of front as in like a criminal front where like I have in the back of house, I'm doing some crimes, but the front is protecting me from, is what I'm faking. Like I'm ostensibly running a bake shop, and that's my front, but in the back I'm laundering money or something like that. And so the idea that there might be a front there, I think that metaphor itself I'm a little uncomfortable with, in part because the front of architecture is ultimately like reflecting what's happening in the back. And so it's very hard to do something that's avant-garde, at least today with technology, that isn't also drawing from or being traced by the problems of today. So I guess another way of saying that is that I also, and this is just my bias, I don't believe in architectural problems. I believe architecture is in the middle between problems of the environment, problems of aesthetic, and problems of politics. Like ultimately, architecture is the stitching between those things. So that's why I also have a bit of a hard time with this question, because I don't think there really is or should be a bubble around what we call architecture. It's the mechanism by which we relate things that might be speculative, things that are aspirational, economic systems, desires, and we make them tangible. Yes, we affect how we live. Yes, but it's ultimately not possible to draw a clean line around architecture.
I think if I can add on, this is a conversation actually that we have in our partnership. We talk about what's in it for architecture versus all the other constraints and problems, and we are kind of it's a balance for us to be in the world and confront issues, but at the same time hold a lot of space for architecture for the sake of architecture. And I think because architecture does certain things that other disciplines don't do, that we can hold both thoughts at the same time. But it's definitely a conversation that is an ongoing conversation, actually, where I teach at UIC, where it's very much about the discipline of architecture, looking very inward. In my practice, usually practices you necessarily deal with the outside world. So it's a kind of a balance. I understand the question. It's tough. It's tough. Yeah, hard to do.
And perhaps one last question, just not to abuse too much of your time, which I think we can combine several, and it's all about the future of research about drawing. Adolfo asks, where is it happening? Is it in the SciArc, the Bartlett, the AA? Chicago wrist. And also, Eduardo asks what or how to make this sort of research profitable.
I'm not sure about profitable. What, like monetarily profitable?
I guess,
Maybe
yes.
not, but yeah. I think there's a lot of programs that are dealing with architectural representation in interesting ways. Um, uh, Probably every program is dealing with architectural representation, and it's pretty depending on what your interest is and your taste of which places you think are the more interesting places. SIARC is doing one set of studies. Um, you know, my schools are doing a different set of studies. I'm currently actually, I don't know if Christina and Karina are still on the line, but I'm actually trying to take the drawing research that I did with them and other studios at Columbia and UIC and IIT and turn it into a publication. So this is just a notice for them that I'll be emailing them to get their permission to use their drawings. But yeah, I don't know. Oh, Karina says good. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either. And I think this question is also super interesting because you can ask, where is it happening? But then also, how is it happening? Like, if in the future of architectural drawing, what will our methods look like? What will our schools of thought look like, in addition to like the schools themselves? Where will unusual allies be formed? And I think if there's one lesson in design and architecture, is that people who are very confident about predicting the future are very likely to be wrong. So the one thing I will say is that I do appreciate a community or a culture that is invested and reflective. So there are some very intense drawing cultures that are blindly looking forward and kind of buying into certain trends. And there are others that are pretending trends don't exist or just resisting or like putting their head in the sand like they're ostriches. And I think both of them are extremely dangerous. And I'm much more interested in like experimenting, going all in on certain trends or certain impulses, but then reflecting and like bringing other ideas into the fold. I think a good litmus test is, are you in a community that loves and experiments with drawing, and do the drawings look different from one another? Like, those are two very healthy qualities of drawing discourse. And I also, to the profitability question, I think there is a possibility for drawings and representation to potentially reorient where the value is. And so do I have a recipe to make money or get rich by drawing? Definitely not. But I do definitely, trust me, I do not. But is it possible for a drawing to disrupt financial structures, right? To suggest that the value of architecture is generated based on a relationship between governments, communities, and societies, as opposed to wealthy clients, right? And there's a different framework of profitability. Yeah, I think drawing can do that type of work. It's a long game. And, I think oddly, two courses that go together really well in schools are professional practice courses and drawing and representation courses. Like those are actually oftentimes places in the curriculum that are, one deals with business and contracts and law, and the other one is aspirational and speculative and maybe unrealistic. And they're actually often really invested in kind of the same questions. And so whoever is asking that question, if you're like, academia is a great place to push those limits. Like, I'm also a big believer in, we should expect academia to confront some of these questions rather than be safely away from, concerns of economies and governments and politics, and make beautiful drawings.
I think that's a very interesting end. Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Sarah, for your time. It's been very interesting and very rich to listen to both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Carl. It was an honor to have you here. And I think your conversation raised more questions than answers. So I think that's great. And that's extremely provocative for our students. So thank you so much for everything.
Yeah, I wanted to share the thought that we had commented that we wanted both of you in the same panel because we knew you would bring very different perspectives, but yes, complement each other. So I'm glad you also got to meet each other. Perhaps maybe shed light in the future that you can, think about drawing, making something together. It'd be great to see both of your work sort of merge. But thank you for for being here and giving us your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Así se grabó todo, ¿no, Cristian?